recording. Tonight, we at Chaucer's are so excited to welcome our author for the evening, journalist Liz Brown. Journalist by trade, Liz's writing has appeared in Book Forum, Design Observer, Elle Decor, London Review of Books, Los Angeles Times, the New York Times Book Review, and several other publications. For her first book, Penguin Press, Twilight Man, Love and Ruin in the Shadows of Hollywood and the Clark Empire, she picked a doozy in more ways than one. Not only is this book a revealing, entertaining, and often heartbreaking book, part of the Clark family saga, but it is a personal story for the author because she is a part of it. And it is because of this and her own journalistic background, she was the one person who could tell this heretofore unknown story, and tell it she did. Please welcome Liz Brown. Hi, Liz.
Hey, thank you. That was really nice.
So let's get right into it. What is your relation to the Clark family?
My great-granduncle is William Andrews Clark Jr., who founded the Los Angeles Philharmonic. He was instrumental in founding the Hollywood Bowl, and he also established the Clark Library, which is here in LA, and he has the largest mausoleum in Hollywood Forever Cemetery. And he has had all that money because he was a member of the Clark Copper Dynasty, which was a major Gilded Age mining family that made the origin of their money came from Montana, but it also came from other states as well.
Well, Will Clark, as you say in his book, was pretty well known. His father was much more known, wasn't he?
Right. His father was Senator William Andrews Clark Sr. He was, he sort of carved up Montana even before it was a state, and really was one of the so-called Copper Kings who monopolized the state. And he basically bribed his way into his Senate seat. And it took him 4 times to the right formula of bribery and threat and whatnot. And he also married his ward, who was, I think, 40 years younger than he was. And so he was very notorious. That marriage was very notorious when it was announced, when he announced it, I think in 1903 or whenever the newspapers got a hold of it. So he was, scandal followed him. Yeah.
You're talking about Kate, correct?
About
his wife.
His wife's name, his first wife's name was Kate, and that was Will Clark's mother.
Will Clark's mother.
He had a second wife. I'm sorry if I confused it. He had a second wife after his first wife died, and that marriage was very notorious.
And it's also well known locally, of course. William A. Clark. On the left is Andre Clark, who Santa Barbara's famous bird refuge is named after. And on the right, who was more in the news, was Huguette Clark, who passed away about 7 years ago at the age of 105, who owned the Bilascardo estate in Santa Barbara. It was huge. It was huge in the news, wasn't it?
Yeah, that Huguette's death, really, in the battle for her estate, is how the Clarks, I think, came back into public awareness. I mean, they had been very much a tabloid family 100 years ago, and then faded from public consciousness or awareness. And then with Huguette's death and this astounding fortune, suddenly people became aware of the Clarks again.
And how familiar were you with your family's history?
Well, it's our connection to them is somewhat circuitous or tangential, and so it wasn't. My grandmother's aunt married Will Clark, and that's how I was connected. But they were very much involved. Aunt Alice and Uncle Will, as they were known, were very, very much involved in my grandmother's life. And she was something of a surrogate daughter at times for them. They didn't have children of their own together, and she was a bit of was sort of their surrogate daughter in that, in a way. And I would hear references to Uncle Will and Aunt Alice, but I didn't really probe or really think about it too much, even though there was a very large oil painting of Aunt Alice in my grandmother's house that I passed every day, but I never really inquired. There was a presence, but not, but it just, I didn't go digging, I didn't go asking, and I don't remember. It wasn't until my grandmother died, unfortunately, that I suddenly started to have more of an interest.
You were close to your grandmother, weren't you? You said you had mentioned that you had lived with her for a number of years while you were in high school in San Francisco.
Yeah.
How close? Yeah.
Yeah. I suspect those kinds of arrangements might be, or that kind of dynamic might be more familiar generations ago, where there's more, where you live with your grandparents, or your grandparents are part of your lives in more of a daily way. But this was somewhat unusual. I grew up in Chico in Northern California, and then I went to high school in San Francisco, and I lived with my grandmother, who had a house in Pacific Heights, and went to the nearby Catholic high school there, Convent of the Sacred Heart. And so I lived with her, the two of us, in her enormous Pacific Heights house for about 3 years. So it was, yeah, it was an unusual, there was definitely a closeness and a dailiness that perhaps not a lot of people have with a grandmother.
But it wasn't until her death that you had discovered something that you found very interesting, and it didn't come in the form of letters or any documents, but rather a photo. And who is Harrison Post? He's on the cover of your book right here.
Yeah.
But who is Harrison Post?
Well, that was what I wanted to know. I found that photo in 2003, like a few days after my grandmother had died. And just incidentally, she was a childhood friend of Huguette's. They were girls together. And she also was a woman with longevity. She lived to be 96 or 97. And she died in 2003, and a few days after the funeral, or after the memorial, I had been just going through her things, sort of in a kind of pilgrimage or quest, I guess, to kind of grab onto her or to retain something. And I guess some more context is that several years before that, I had come out to my parents and told them I was gay, and they had a hard time accepting that. And so it had been a pretty tough several years of a kind of impasse between us. And so when I came back for the funeral, that was also, that event was charged with that, with being in this kind of impasse as well. And so I opened a drawer and found this photo and just instantly wanted it. I mean, he looks like Rudolph Valentino.
Yeah.
He's mysterious, he's sexy, I don't know what, I just had no idea. And I also just couldn't fathom who he was to my grandmother.
So did this come right away, this idea for a story, or how long did this process take you before you realized that you had something?
It was a long process. I took the photo, I Googled him, I couldn't find anything about who he was. And then separately, I started my curiosity about my grandmother's Uncle Will started to manifest, and
Mhm.
and because I knew there were these rumors, I'd heard there were rumors that he was gay, that Uncle Will had been gay.
Mhm.
And one of the thing about the Clarks is there was, until Huguette's death, the only real document about them was a scandalous tell-all written in the 40s by a disgruntled former employee,
Mhm.
which divulged all kinds of secrets, or purported to divulge all types of secrets, including the fact that Will Clark had been gay and had
Mhm.
this secret life. And so that had really piqued my interest, and I started kind of trying to track down his story, and I found that tell-all biography, and it took a while to track that down, because the rumor is that the family had tried to buy up all the copies they could and burned them, and I don't know that that's true, but
Mhm.
but there are a few copies, and I found one, and in it I was reading through it, looking actually more for my grandmother, for any mention of her, and it did mention that she had inherited $10,000 from Will Clark, but that was all the only mention of her. And then it said, as I came across that, and then the author said, but the bulk of the estate of Will Clark's estate went to his perverted disciples, including Harrison Post.
Perverted.
Perverted disciples.
Oh, wow. Wow. So they really didn't mince words there, did they?
So,
Well, obviously this book was part of one of your sources, but there's no way you could have gotten all this information into this wonderful book just from that. And what assistance or what research did you have other than that?
a lot of, I mean, some of it was there are a lot of court records, because there were a lot of lawsuits, and Harrison's story, when he met Will Clark, he was sort of plunged into this world of money and wealth and status, and
Mhm. Mhm.
but he also became a target for
Mm.
people, blackmail, extortion, including his sister, who targeted him. And so there were a lot of legal battles, and so there was a lot from the LA Hall of Records was a very important
Mhm.
resource, but the real crucial breakthrough for me was meeting a woman named Sue Lombardi, who is an
Mm.
art history professor in the Bay Area. And I should mention that the librarian from the Clark connected us, and the Clark Library here in LA connected us. And I spoke with Sue on the phone before we met in person, and she was just, she was really funny, and she was really warm, and she was saying, I have these journals, and if you're ever in town, you should come by. And I was basically I was living in New York at the time, and I basically was on a plane
Mhm.
as soon as I could. And
Mhm.
and these journals she had were the journals Harrison kept for the last 3 or 4 years of his life. She had an address book that has names like Greta Garbo and Carol Lombard in it.
Wow.
And as soon as I saw these physical objects, and as soon as I saw his handwriting, and I knew this is a bigger story, and I have the material, and I have the firsthand connection to him. Now he's not
Mhm.
just a photo; he's his own voice. He on a page.
So you wanted to do the story obviously from Harrison's point of view, then. Is that correct?
I
Or
did, and um, I did, and I think part of that is of all the figures in this story, in this saga, the one I kind of empathized with the most, I think.
Mhm.
There's a really interesting connection or intersection in the story between gay identity
Mhm.
and extreme wealth. The Clark
Okay.
family just had I mean, they were Jeff Bezos level, they were Robert Mercer level. They just had so much money and controlled so much of the nation's resources.
Mhm.
And in a way, what I was drawn to was that Harrison, he entered that world, but he wasn't of it. And he definitely had a vulnerability that appealed to me, I think, that I felt
Mhm.
connected to. And he's definitely he's an outsider until he enters
Mhm.
this world of wealth and access, and then becomes a kind of insider, although many people still don't want to treat him that way. And
Mhm.
that conundrum of his situation really appealed to me.
Mhm. So before we get deep into the characters, if you don't mind synopsizing your book, I mean, for those, this is stuff that I've read, fortunately, but if you can
Sure.
explain.
So I think the shortest way I can, the simplest way I've been able to synopsize this story is to say it is about a gay Hollywood millionaire whose sister steals his fortune. That's the
Mm.
shortest way. But the bigger thing is sort of what I was mentioning, is it's the story of this man who falls into this incredible wealth, this incredible empire, the Clark empire, and his journey through that, and the way that both, it's rags to riches, the way that gives him incredible power and also makes him a target. Um, and that when that world recedes, he has to figure out how to remake his life. And I guess
Mm.
that's a very general way of talking about it, but I guess I don't know if there's another way. Well, I don't know. Ask me another question, and maybe
Okay.
I will
Okay.
will narrow it
Well,
down a little bit.
what's the reasoning behind the title, Twilight Man?
Oh, sure. So Twilight Man, and that also I should say I owe to the Scandalous Tell-All biography, which was written by William Mangum, and he says in it that this perverted disciple, Harrison Post, was the type known as the Twilight Man or Twilight Men, and that was my first time ever encountering that term. And it was briefly a term for gay men
Mm.
in the 30s. And I can show you, actually, I have a prop here. This is
Ah.
a book written, I think it was written in the late 20s or early 30s, called Twilight Men, The Story of a Homosexual.
Mhm.
And it's kind of a pulp fiction story.
Mhm.
But that I had not ever heard that term before, so that was my first encounter with it. And also
Mhm.
he just has such an in-between status that he sort of, even though it means like imagining gay men in this sort of in-between or dark in the shadows, I also just thought he in his this, whether he actually had this wealth, whether he actually could be an insider, um,
Mm.
you know, he was always in a very precarious place, or an in between in a twilight
Okay.
place.
That's a great description of that. Your story, the story itself is so sprawling. I mean, you're going to Norway. There's a Nazi prison camp in there, Mexico, Hollywood, Carol Lombard you mentioned, and Joan Crawford doing the Charleston, all these things. And it was so matter of fact to these people. But there's so many people, there's so many places, so many things happen, yet it's a character-driven story. And the first person I'd like to talk about is Will Clark, because if there was no Clark family, there really wouldn't be a story. And what was your take on your research and what you wrote about William A. Clark?
Sure. He was really a very complicated figure for me to write about and to research, and still is, I find, a very complex figure. And when I started writing this, I really wanted to just write a gay, think of this as like I was recuperating, I think, a gay romance that they were so targeted for being gay, and their lives were so constrained that I saw them purely as victims. And I kind of wanted to tell a story, sort of that it would be this triumphant thing to resurrect their romance. But it was complicated because he belonged to this ruthless dynasty that thought nothing of taking over other people's lives, whether it was the way his father consolidated his mining resources and buying property and foreclosing on people's claims, and his own kind of questionable business practices, or whether, like I mentioned earlier, it was, grooming this teenage girl to be his wife. And so I started to, as I was researching, I started to find aspects of Will's story that were not so savory, and that kind of followed his father's own path in those terms. And so he couldn't be this kind of gay martyr. He just simply couldn't be that, because he's not. He's was also this incredibly wealthy man with a lot of power, who didn't always deploy it in the most noble ways. And so then it became, and his arc is a very dark one, he has this kind of exuberant, expansive period in the 1920s where he's founding the LA Philharmonic, and he's really contributing a lot to Los Angeles in its cultural fabric. And then as the years go on, he kind of retreats from a lot of those philanthropic efforts. And I mean, I don't want to give too much away, but he starts also, you see him sort of taking you see him taking an interest in a similar way that his father did with this young girl, to the son of his housekeeper. And this I hesitate, I guess I try to pick my words very carefully when I talk about this, because this is something I have no firsthand knowledge about. And the writing I found about that I found of other people writing about that relationship between Will Clark and the housekeeper's son was hearsay, and so I hesitate to, I guess I just want, that's why I sort of am hesitant to name exactly what that relationship was, but other people didn't hesitate and had very troubling things to say about it. So
and a lot of that,
yeah,
go ahead.
all of that is to say he just wasn't an easy person to, he was a hard character to stay with sometimes.
Well, even when he was younger, you had to feel some empathy about what was written about him. And I loved how you described it, how he's described as extremely nervous, quote unquote. There are readers who understood what an extremely nervous young man was also the kind of young man who'd enjoy the company of another delicate boy. Whereas if you just read that and you didn't think about that, you take that as face value, but especially if the reader was ignorant, but if they're ignorant of worlds and inclinations or wish to appear so, the codes remain simply words on the page. But however, it was written in a way where people who understood that kind of, they kind of slandered him, I would say. And I'm sure that was tough, not only being the namesake of this great, powerful man, but also being painted in such a light. It was, and I'm sure it's very difficult for him.
Yeah. I mean, he was a very generous man. He was incredibly generous to my grandmother. She adored him. There were plenty of people who had a lot of warmth for him. And I do think as the son of this kind of notorious figure, he was under scrutiny in a way. Perhaps no one wants to be under scrutiny in that way.
Which, some of the stuff he did, I mean, his father cast a long shadow, but he was able to find his own way in a lot of ways with the Philharmonic. I mean, he was part of the start of the Hollywood Bowl too, wasn't he? As far as financing, so he made his own niche. But I mean, the biggest thing in this book, obviously, is his relationship with Harrison. And first of all, if you can talk about Harrison and where he came from, and then go into how he met Will.
Sure. So Harrison's name wasn't Harrison Post when he was born. It was Albert Weiss Harrison, and he was the son of a clothing salesman named Mark Harrison and a woman named Jenny Weiss, who was the daughter of a opera house impresario from Galveston, Texas. So he's not exactly born into wealth, but he's sort of born into what I thought of as like the proximity to wealth. His father wasn't wealthy. His father was a clothing salesman who seemed to lose his job every few months and relocate. And his parents had a very tumultuous marriage and a very short-lived marriage, but they had 5 kids within about 4 years or 5 years or something very, very short. And so he bounced around a lot as a kid. And then he sort of, when his parents separated and he ended up going with his father, they'd been on the East Coast, and then he goes with his father to Sacramento. And that's where his father sort of starts over and becomes a kind of local clothier in Sacramento and seems to do quite well. And then when his father dies, he's really on his own again, because the rest of the family had pretty much abandoned him at that point. And he ends up being taken in by this kindly older widow named Mary Post. And that's sort of his first salvation in a way, I would think of. It's almost like he sort of walks into this fairy tale. The kindly older widow takes him in, and then a couple years later, while he's working at this luxury boutique in San Francisco, Will Clark walks in and soon a romance commences, and he's whisked off to Los Angeles. And he's about 21 when that happens, and Will was probably in his early 40s. So he's this very bumpy, itinerant life, and then suddenly he's plunged into this very glamorous and wealthy world in LA.
And I think you wrote at one point that it wasn't just that he knew famous people, but famous people knew who he was just by the association. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, there's sort of tiers of fame in a way, you know, and I think he was famous among the famous, but he wasn't famous to, you know, people who were buying fan magazines or going to the movie. And he was in he had a different kind of fame. And I thought of him as a kind of aristocrat in a way, in an American aristocrat.
So how was he able to, I mean, obviously he made all these trips with Will. How was he able to travel? I mean, two men traveling together.
Sure. Yeah, one of their tactics, I guess, was they often traveled in an entourage, and Will always had a valet or butler or someone who managed his affairs, and they always traveled with a few friends. For a while they were traveling with a Catholic priest. So make of that what you want. Yeah, they had their way of kind of masking the relationship.
And Harrison himself seemed like a very interesting person. His personality was very unique, and he seemed to feel that he belonged into this world, even though he didn't come from that world.
Yeah, I kind of think of that as his sort of, I'm going to turn my light on because I have.
Okay.
I will tell me if I need to or not. It's just the light is going down outside, and so it's changing.
Okay.
But if you don't think, see if I can. I don't know.
That works.
Anyway, he definitely felt comfortable. I think I don't know if I would call it entitled, but I definitely think, you know, he grew up in hotels and as a little kid, and sort of, I imagine him in a kind of having a kind of familiarity with a lot of having a kind of cosmopolitan attitude, I guess, that he was definitely able to it wasn't a hard jump for him to move from being someone who took care of the wealthy to being wealthy himself, I guess.
And were they able to move, you know, as a couple, even though it was under the guise of being his secretary, were they able to move through society pretty easily? Or were they accepted as who they were?
I think Will Clark compartmentalized his life. I mean, they didn't really live together. They lived across the street from each other in West Adams here in Los Angeles. So Will had his own home and Harrison had his home right across the street. And Will would often spend 3 months out of the year in Montana. He had a summer home there, and he would spend that with a lot of his friends from Montana. My grandmother would go and spend summers there. And so I think he had these separate worlds a little bit. Although everyone knew of Harrison, but then he and Harrison would go and spend 3 months traveling through Europe together. I think they definitely felt safer, I think, and definitely felt more at ease in Europe than they did in America. They were constantly either being targeted either being blackmailed or getting into difficulty with the neighbors who didn't like the parties they were throwing. And so they sort of had a couple different lives. They had a life together. They each seemed to have lives apart from each other. But I think among the people who knew them, there wasn't any, I think it was probably an open secret and about what the nature of their relationship was.
You mentioned the wild parties. There were certainly some wild parties, and isn't one of the houses now a Buddhist monastery or something like that?
Yeah, it's a Zen center. It's a Zen temple, which is one of my favorite things about this strange trajectory of Harrison's life. Will Clark built a compound basically in West Adams and established a library there, and the library is still there, but the mansion he had an observatory, those are gone. Wow. But the library is still there. It's part of UCLA. It's a wonderful spot. And right across the street was Harrison's house, and that was this kind of Spanish colonial villa, walled in, and supposedly there were, to quote William Mangum, there were indescribable orgies. And sadly, no one described them, so I wasn't able to in the book. But that building where there were these so-called indescribable orgies is now a Zen center, and I've gone and meditated there, and with the monks and the devotees, and it's a very special place.
So you're saying the readers will have to use their imagination when reading about these orgies then?
Yeah.
Also, I don't know if this is the correct room, but on the ceiling is a mural. And unfortunately, this came up from the internet. And there were 13 figures, and they were all of Harrison, weren't they?
Yes, that is not.
That's not the one.
That's not the room with Harrison's face. That is the chamber music.
It's not that one either.
That's the room. Yeah.
Okay. So on the ceiling here, there's 13 Harrisons, aren't there?
Yeah.
And that still exists at the Clark Library, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's closed right now, but I think it will be opening in a month or two.
You were able to go in this, weren't you?
Yeah.
When you were, okay. I just find that really interesting.
This is another site.
So,
yeah.
And that's on West Adams, correct?
Yeah, that's in West Adams, on the corner of West Adams and Cimarron, and that's the foyer that you're looking at.
Okay.
And I remember when the first time I went there, which was about 10 years ago, talking to the librarian there, and explaining my connection to Will Clark and my curiosity about Harrison. And that was another momentous breakthrough, where she pointed across the street and said, Harrison used to live in that house there. And then she pointed up to the ceiling and said, they're all different bodies, but they're all Harrison's face.
Wow. Which
I loved. I mean, I don't know. They took measures to kind of, in some ways, it's not that stealth to paint your lover's face 13 times on a ceiling, but there was some plausible deniability. They could always.
Okay. Well, not only did they share a passion and a love, but they also shared some creativity, and they were involved in transcribing some letters of Oscar Wilde. And I'm sure they can sense they can be empathetic toward Oscar Wilde, who struggled with his own, with his own homosexuality with Lord Alfred Douglas. And if you could talk just a little bit about this and what they did without revealing anything in your book.
Well, Will Clark was a book collector, and among his many interests, collecting rare books was significant, and his collection is housed at the Clark Library, and he was notable also for really focusing on collecting Oscar Wilde in the 1920s, and one of their sort of collaborations was he bought these letters that Wilde had written to Lord Alfred Douglas before he was sentenced to prison, and then and also his letters afterward, and Will purchase those letters and then gave Harrison the task of transcribing them. And I mean, the letters are very valuable for a bibliophile, but of course, Harrison and Will also had this other element that the letters in a way were an opportunity for them to express their love, that they weren't able necessarily to leave their letters behind. And they made sure they didn't, but the fact that they could transcribe these artifacts from a previous same-sex love affair, I found very moving, and I found it I read into it that it was a way for them to kind of express their own desire and affection. I also looked at it a little bit as a bit of a curse, in a way, that in literally transcribing those letters, they seem to almost inscribe that story into their own lives. There are so many echoes of Wilde's fate in their lives, in the way their lives played out, that I found something kind of ghostly or haunting about them purchasing those letters and physically rewriting them, and then their own lives would have echoes of that, of Wilde's very tragic end of his life too.
Okay, we're running a little lower on time. I invite you to ask questions right now if you have, but I'll ask one more question. Plus, I don't want to reveal anything in the book because there is so much packed in this book in regards to Harrison Post, even after the passing of Will Clark, that it's almost unbelievable what happened to Harrison Post. But Liz, the story is personal, not only because of your family, but because of your own homosexuality. And I wanted to read a quote that you wrote at the beginning and then ask you a question. And you wrote, "I wanted to recuperate a lost gay history as a way to assert my own queer lineage, salve my sense of injury by illuminating a love story that had been wrongfully erased. It would mean vindication for Will and Harrison and for me. If only it were that simple." How did this story, writing the story, what did that mean to you to be able to tell this story?
It changed, over time. In the beginning, it did feel sort of like a way to settle a score a little bit. I mean, I feel like that's a simplistic way and perhaps ungenerous to myself to say it that way. But I think when I started it, it was this feeling of wanting, as I wrote, wanting to recuperate something. And so often I think it's easier to stand up for someone else or sometimes in a way take care of someone else than to do that for yourself, you know. And in Harrison's story, I mean, yes, we haven't talked about how he ends up in prison camps in Nazi occupied Norway. His story is so extreme that in a way it's easier, or it's, you know, so dramatic and spectacular that it's easier or more compelling, I guess, to tell that than to maybe tell your own story or to tell my own story. And I was thinking about this the other day, actually, and I was trying to, and there was another way I was talking about it that I was thinking about it that was not the phrase score settling, but I can't remember right now. Of course it'll come to me as soon as this is over. But I think that feeling that I was going to right a wrong, it really changed over time. And a lot of that was just my own circumstance with my family changed. And I didn't have that kind of need to, that need for vindication, I guess, or that need to, I think it's not about vindication, it was about witnessing, about being witnessed, you know. And he was erased, and I felt a certain form of erasure myself. And so there's something about putting his story back into the world that felt like, this is how I'm putting myself back into the world. And that, and that I still feel that, but the need for it changed. You know, I then did feel witnessed in ways I hadn't before. So, but I think, do you know, there's the epigraph in the book is a quote from Antigone, and over time, as I was, you know, researching his story, and we haven't really been able to talk too much about his relationship to his sister, was really his downfall. But I thought a lot about siblings and different types of sibling stories in literature and history. And I ended up thinking about Antigone because her story is that she makes it her mission to make sure her brother has a proper burial, that he is buried with dignity, because he'd been cast out and his body has been is just lying in the sun. And in some way, that's what I sort of ended up feeling about Harrison, that this wasn't so much about settling a score. By the end of it, it just felt like, how do I put this man to rest in a way that gives his life dignity?
I think you've succeeded in doing that. I think that you've managed to bring out a forgotten person that shouldn't be forgotten. So thank you.
Thank you.
I have one question from a YouTuber. Has any of the family read this book?
Oh, yes. I think they all have. And my mother has read it twice. And I think might be the biggest fan of the book, which I didn't necessarily expect. And I have no complaints about that.
Is mom on right now? Do we know if mom's on?
No, she's not on, but we'll share. We can share the YouTube with her later.
Okay, all right. So Glauco Arau wanted to know, any particular story left that's not in the book for some reason?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. There's so many things I just couldn't put in there. Just because of space, you know, it's already a long book. I'm trying to think of some offhand. I should have some at the ready because there were so many. You know, there's I guess one thing I would have liked to have been able to just really sink into more, and there just wasn't time, is there's a point at which Harrison's books, his collected library, is disbanded and sold at auction, very similar to what happened to Oscar Wilde when he was jailed. And I would have liked to have spent, I wish to sort of follow that and to even sort of try to track down some of those books, which I think might be at the Getty, because J.P. Getty was at the auction.
Yeah.
Those books, and that is its own, another tendril here that you could follow, is what happened to those books. So that's just one.
And Harrison loved books. I mean, he was an accomplished bookbinder too, as one of his many skills. So yeah, it's heartbreaking, that whole scene of selling those books at auction for so little money that, okay, I better not say anything else here. Okay, so Craig Seligman said, nothing has been said about the best aspect of the book, the beauty of the prose. Is there a passage that you're particularly fond of?
I know that, Craig Seligman. I will say there are two sentences that helped me know what the book was about. And when I wrote them, I knew I understood the story what was trying to tell. And it took a long, I wish those sentences had come earlier, but they are, if I can remember it correctly, it was as if he had been banished, but he hadn't gone anywhere. It was the kingdom that disappeared. And that, to me, I felt was the crux of the story, was this man feeling sort of feeling the world has changed, as if you've been on a glacier and it's suddenly melted, and it's gone. The thing you thought was fixed has disappeared. And that, to me, felt like the crux of the book and the crux of Harrison's story.
Well said. Well, Liz Brown, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It was a wonderful talk, and please, everyone, buy Twilight Man. It's a great book.
Thank you so much, Michael. This was really lovely.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please have a nice evening. Good night.